Good morning and welcome to this talk on Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. It is my distinct privilege to be invited to offer my thoughts on Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. The first thought in a discussion on Sri Aurobindo is about declaring one's location. How do I locate myself with respect to Sri Aurobindo? The very thought opens my eyes and I look at a multi-dimensional personality, and the sight is awe-inspiring. I become aware of the magnificence of his stature and naturally feel an inadequacy at having to assess Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. Here I am, literate, but I wouldn't say properly educated, reasonably informed, but not sufficiently empowered by learning to undertake this project. And when I look at the poets and writers, scholars, critics, and the scholar critics dedicating their lives in order to absorb and live the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, I become more acutely aware of my own location. I see before me a sage, a yogi, a meticulous diarist, a philosopher, a poet, a translator, a linguist, a political activist, a commentator on culture, a defender of India's ethos, as courageous as her most formidable soldier. I wonder how I would be able to approach such a monumental personality. I shall make a personal assessment of Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. While I'm required to make extensive references to the future poetry and to that monumental work Savitri, in order to make a reasonably passable account, I shall do so by confining my talk to the letters on poetry and art, which form volume 27 of the complete works. Of course, it is not the usual reference for anyone discussing Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. It is unusual that for the range of topics and the intensity with which Sri Aurobindo addresses them, the letters on poetry and art, it has not been referred widely. Volume 27 deserves to be referred widely. The broad topics covered in this volume include: number one, the discussion on the sources, the spirit, the technique of poetry. Number two, the advice to aspiring writers about the language for creative writing. Number three, notes on poets and their practice. And number four, the harmonious relationship among literature, art, poetry, and yoga. One does remember Wordsworth of the Lyrical Ballads, for whom the poet was man speaking to man. One remembers Coleridge of the Biographia Literaria, for whom the poet was that synthetic imagination that was able to reconcile the opposites, the contraries of, say, the abstract with the concrete, the universal with the particular, the idea with the image. One even remembers the American poet Edgar Allen Poe, who in his philosophy of composition would see in the poem the space for the elevation of the soul. And one sees that Sri Aurobindo exceeds all of them in terms of the sustained intensity and the compassion of the sage to patiently address every concern that came to him through letters from friends, acquaintances, and disciples. One can feel the presence of Sri Aurobindo as he sits down to examine the question contained in a letter, even as he responds to each one with the authority of a master of language, but the tolerance of a doting parent for the child that is ambitious, though without the means to realize its potential. One of the finest and wholesome tributes paid to Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic has come from Professor C.D. Narasimhaiah, who in 1989, in the Journal of South Asian Literature, recognizes Sri Aurobindo as, and I quote Professor Narasimhaiah, the inaugurator of modern Indian criticism. This must count as the most accurate and credible assessment of Sri Aurobindo's standing as a literary critic. CDN, as that venerable teacher and true scholar critic, was fondly called by legions of his friends and scholars, was well versed in the Western canon, as well as being a pioneer, along with Professor K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, to inaugurate and glorify the field of study called Indian writing in English. The Literary Criterion, the journal which he founded, was instrumental in promoting not only Indian literature, but also in encouraging the application of Indian aesthetics and critical theories to the appreciation of literature both from India and abroad. Professor Narasimhaiah expresses wonder at why K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, the most influential commentator on Sri Aurobindo's poetry, did not do enough to establish Sri Aurobindo's credentials as a literary critic. Especially when a scholar of Iyengar's stature had recognized Sri Aurobindo to be a responsible critic, no less than T.S. Eliot. Here one must see the lifelong mission of these critics like T.S. Eliot, Matthew Arnold, and Sri Aurobindo to enable the fine discrimination in their constituency of readers and lovers of literature, to be able to separate good literature from great literature. Professor Narasimhaya points out that even before the Cambridge critics, F.R. Lewis and I.A. Richards, very respected and feared in equal measure for their evaluations, could critique major figures of English poetry like, say, Alexander Pope, owing partly to Pope's formidable reputation as a master craftsman, Sri Aurobindo critiques that neoclassical great on the basis of his power to inspire the moral aspect. In Sri Aurobindo's estimation, Alexander Pope is one who, and I quote, has not seen and for that reason cannot make us see. What one can notice in that evaluation is that there is an implied standard insisted upon the poet. It is not enough that they are able to dazzle with their wordplay and amuse the reader with their interesting use of images. The poet must be capable of seeing and be equally capable of communicating that vision. What is evident in that assessment is that Sri Aurobindo's criticism is not confined to the verbal excellence of the poet alone. It has a deep concern for the valuable experience that can be communicated to the reader. As much as he reads the poet, he also remembers the poet's duty towards the reader. Professor Narasimhaya places Sri Aurobindo in the haloed line of ancient poets who epitomized the higher function of poetry in which philosophical thinking is yoked to spiritual seeing. In the year 1921, T.S. Eliot reviewed Herbert J.C. Grierson's anthology, Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century, in an influential essay titled The Metaphysical Poets. The qualification metaphysical was used pejoratively by some of the leading poets since the Scottish poet William Drummond in 1630 and later John Dryden and after him Dr. Samuel Johnson. Eliot, on his part, had other intentions. He admired the metaphysical poets like John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell for their wit and conceit. Conceit is that a remarkable quality, the ability to unite thought with feeling. Eliot was enamored of the metaphysicals and adopted their style as the distinguishing method of the modern poet. He himself demonstrated the metaphysical conceit in his The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, that a singular quality of the 17th century poets, which he called the unification of a sensibility. It is uncanny that around that same time, Sri Aurobindo was demonstrating a style of poetry that can truly be described as unification of sensibility. However, when one examines the letters in which Sri Aurobindo journeys into the spirit and the very source of poetry, one must admit that he was talking about and demonstrating a unique kind of poetry that goes beyond the average poet's wrestle with technique and craft, style and diction, meter and rhythm. To Sri Aurobindo, poetry is a higher calling, and the poet is one who responds to the call. That call is not answered merely by the poet's skill at turning out well-wrought, schooled lines. It doesn't come merely with the talent for writing. Sri Aurobindo's letters suggest that one needs to surrender to the higher powers that are within us and above us. One needs to prepare oneself spiritually before one gets down to gather the linguistic tools. In this, one can see the practice of yoga. There are the yama and niyama phases of cultivating the mind and the body for the yoga of poetry writing. The act of writing is no different from the practice of yoga. The idea of the literary critic as yogi is not to imply that all yogis are literary critics. But a literary critic would be able to rise above his or her, what Aurobindo calls temperamental sympathies, in order to respond to artistic beauty. Confessing to his own temperamental sympathies, or the lack of them, for poets like Alexander Pope and John Dryden, Sri Aurobindo shows how he is able to rise above the personal and see the, and I quote, extraordinary perfection of force in their field. He refers to the extraordinary perfection and force of Pope and Dryden, the masterly conciseness, energy, point, metallic precision into which they cut their thought or their verse. In this regard, he is quite unlike the Cambridge scholar F.R. Lewis, whose disapproval, especially of the great C.S. Lewis, was nothing short of rudeness and intolerance. Even as Sri Aurobindo appreciates Pope and Dryden, he is quick to see how different these poets are from the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley, with respect to poetic quality. Now, the phrase poetic quality sounds vague and inadequate, even an escape from the exactitude with which terms are used by literary critics. But to Sri Aurobindo, poetic quality is a scale of value that the literary critic possesses by virtue of believing in a conception of beauty and a feeling for beauty. The critic raises himself to the level of appreciating poetic quality. that organically emerges from a deep engagement with beauty. Having ascended to the level of discriminating between one poetic quality, say Pope and Dryden, and another, say Wordsworth and Keats, Sri Aurobindo believes that the literary critic, and I quote, can help to open the mind to the kinds of beauty he himself sees, and not only to discover but to appreciate at their full value certain elements that make them beautiful or give them what is most characteristic or uniform in their peculiar beauty. Unquote. We may not see many poets or even literary critics who have spoken or written about poetic creation. At one end of the spectrum are poets like Keats, and at the other end are poets like Edgar Allan Poe. I mention John Keats because he alludes to a quality of inspiration in his letter to a friend, John Taylor. This was written from Hampstead, February 27, 1818, in which Keats admits to following three axioms for poetry. The third axiom is the more widely known declaration on poetic creation, that, and I quote Keats here, if poetry comes not as naturally as leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. Unquote. But it is in the first two axioms that Keats comes closer to Sri Aurobindo. I think poetry should surprise by a fine excess. It should strike the reader as wording his own highest thoughts, says Keats. Sri Aurobindo would not see any act of poetic creation as the wording of the poet's highest thoughts. While the idea of the highest thoughts are verbalized in his own style by Sri Aurobindo, he would see the poet as the medium that conducts these thoughts into the world. Keats expresses the second axiom on beauty in affective terms as that which leaves the reader breathless than merely content. To Sri Aurobindo, the affective is one of the layers. There is a spiritual level which begins to rise only when the affective realm is surpassed. However, the Keatsian reference to imagery, and I quote, rising like the sun and tracing its natural trajectory to finally settle into the luxury of twilight, unquote, resembles the process of poetic creation in Sri Aurobindo, where the poetic mind waits for and allows the conduct of the thing as pure transcript. Pure transcript is a phrase of Sri Aurobindo. It is how the poet allows himself to be a medium to conduct that creative energy that flows through him. At the other end of the spectrum is Edgar Allan Poe, whose philosophy of composition is written with his confidence in the poet's ability to affect and manipulate the reader's response. To this end, he proposes a manifesto for poetry in which the poet is able to decide the denouement or the overall plan of the poem even before the first line is composed. Poe famously uses the image of the Chinese builders who are known to build the house from the roof downwards, he says, or like one of the novelists who wrote the novel Caleb Williams from the end backwards. He demonstrates through his poem, The Raven, that the poem is neither an accident or an intuition, that it is possible to proceed step by step to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. I'm not sure if Sri Aurobindo would admit so much of cocksureness while one is involved in the creative process. The decisiveness of Poe about intention in the poet might have seemed to Sri Aurobindo as tending towards a mental manufacture, as opposed to a pure transcript. The mind of the philosopher does inform the responses of the literary critic. I say this because, like Coleridge, who was a philosopher among poets and who brought the exacting precision of the philosopher among literary critics, in that he makes subtle but clear distinctions with respect to forming judgment. While to most literary critics, the writer is synonymous with the novelist, to Sri Aurobindo, there is a difference based on the proportion of language style to content. We must infer from his discussion of Charles Dickens and Balzac that one is either a novelist by virtue of the power of his or her substance, or a writer by virtue of his or her style. He demonstrates the lack of style in a Dickens because he is, Sri Aurobindo says, slipshod. The saving grace lies in his stories and characters. Like Balzac, Dickens is the greatest of novelists but the worst of writers, says Sri Aurobindo. I am struck by the magisterial assurance with which he is able to arrive at these judgments of the great canonical writers. Like any philosopher's mind, the mind of Sri Aurobindo, the literary critic, works through classifications, descriptions, distinctions, categories, divisions, and definitions, and of course an unmatched precision. Having characterized him as a philosopher, literary critic, I would like to emphasize that while he was firm to express his opinion, he was far from being opinionated. There is a Dharma one notices in the way Sri Aurobindo performs his duty as a literary critic. He does not shy away from an opinion because where he has won, he is not only informed but willing to express it with all the forthrightness and without the slightest ambiguity. Perhaps he is quite aware of others looking up to him for legislation in matters of literary debate, controversy, or unresolved problems. It is also conceivable that he took his role as a conscientious commentator on art and poetry seriously because it was equally vital an activity which required the spirit of service, as the detailed and not so detailed correspondence testify. What I observe about this position he enjoyed among his friends and followers is the amount of power and importance that would have turned most individuals assertive and pushed them to the point of becoming dogmatic. It is interesting to note that Sri Aurobindo is consistently democratic and a keen listener. While he sees no purpose bigger than forming and defending one's convictions, he believes that others do have an equal right to form and defend their opinions. That spirit of accommodation and the capacity to listen lent to his thoughts less belligerence and a unique tone that, though argumentative, demands of the reader or listener their complete attention. We can always ask ourselves, what kind of a mind was Sri Aurobindo's? It was a mind that was not confined to any country or culture or climate. It was a mind that was open to the flowering of human consciousness and the finest expressions of that flowering from everywhere. In that respect, Sri Aurobindo possessed a mind that valued the efforts in poetry and art, that was earnest about providing the most vital expressions in language. To this end, all creative men and women were alike, and he did not discriminate between the less civilized and the more civilized, the less cultivated and the more cultivated, the less schooled and the more schooled. On the contrary, he did distinguish between the less realized and the more realized. On that scale, everyone is evolving towards a greater self-realization, like samskara. The author poet too is seen to be seeking and attaining to a higher realization, a samskara, the mindful effort to ascend to higher consciousness. As in life, so in art. Sri Aurobindo possessed such a mind, and so his opinions, comments, answers are not swayed by considerations of authority that one would see in the evaluations of a poet critic like Matthew Arnold. There is no great Homer, or great Milton, or great Dickens, or great Balzac in his scheme of appreciation. He brings the yogi's equanimity of spirit in his responses, offering praise where praise is due and very energetically criticizing the flaws in a poet or writer because he is convinced they are flaws that they take away from the realization of beauty in poetry and art. In the eyes of a critic like Sri Aurobindo, everyone is alike. A Homer must become Homer, not out of any obligation on the part of the critic to celebrate the master, nor is there the condescension of the learned critic in guiding a novice or a fledgling poet or artist. Seen from this perspective, Sri Aurobindo is a truly decolonized mind. I like to think that among the great scholars this country has produced and the literary critics, Sri Aurobindo, given his exposure to the best of English education, is a truly decolonized mind and exemplifies the spirit of decolonization that Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about in that discussion, where he takes umbrage at some of the very leading African intellectuals, scholars, and writers who are guilty of being colonized in their mind. Sri Aurobindo is not mindful of the fact, he is not unmindful of the fact that he received the most privileged English education and on his part proved to his masters that he had as much English as the native to express himself with as much force and conviction as necessary. Unlike many of the contemporaries and the generations that followed, he showed how the language of English ought to be mastered. This is not a comment on the importance of English as a language. It is meant to underline Sri Aurobindo's uniqueness in being different from the thousands of educated and cultivated Indians for whom the importance of English as a language makes them obliged to the colonial masters and see in that language the key to India becoming civilized. Sri Aurobindo's uniqueness is in being completely educated in very English ways, to become a proper Englishman, and yet to be able to see through the hypocrisy and sham existence in educated Indians for whom knowing English itself is synonymous with being educated. It is not the language per se, but the ascent of the spirit in and through language that occupied Sri Aurobindo. In that respect, English was merely as serviceable as Bengali or Hindi or Tamil. The poem or essay or drama or even the letter is only a body or form that is necessary for language to show how the spirit manifests. While language is the visible aspect of the manifestation, it is not the end of writing and speaking, or in Sri Aurobindo's phraseology, it is not the ending end of writing and speaking. In fact, one must infer that Sri Aurobindo advocates a transparency of language that allows for the poetic beauty to express itself in as free and unhindered manner as possible. While the poet is expected to know his language, he must realize that mere knowing is far inferior to knowing how the thought is brought into form. That is a knowing that is a measure of self-realization than the degree of mastery in versification or a composition. Staying on the thought of Sri Aurobindo as a decolonized mind, I would like to draw attention to his views on the English poets. While to most readers and critics of English poetry, Dryden or Donne, Chaucer or Hopkins, Wordsworth or Shelley are creators of magnificent poetry, to Sri Aurobindo, they are, some of them, intellectual and mental, who are occasionally stirred by the imagination. While he grants Hopkins the qualities of vision, power, and originality, he sees Hopkins' technique erring on the side of excess. The synthetic mind of Sri Aurobindo compresses almost 300 years of English poetry as moving from the subtle physical poetry of Chaucer through the vital, energetic poetry of Shakespeare to the poetic intelligence and mental poetry of the 18th century poets. While these categories, physical poetry, vital energetic poetry, poetic intelligence, and mental poetry, while these categories are not found in the evaluations of other literary critics, Sri Aurobindo demonstrates the independence, the unrestrained freedom, and vision to create the categories and terms by which he would perform his evaluations. He does not flinch from including the quality of the mystical and the occult, which he found so well expressed by the Celtic poets. In the year 1992, Professor V.S. Sethuraman put together the first major anthology of critical texts with the objective of introducing to English readers Indian aesthetics. In the preface, he declares that the book fills a gap by giving due representation to theoreticians and critics like Anand Kentish Kumaraswamy, Rabindranath Tagore, and Sri Aurobindo. Introducing the section on art and poetry, he describes Sri Aurobindo as a well-known modern philosopher and aesthetician. He recognizes Sri Aurobindo as revolting against the Philistinism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thereby restoring to Indian art its spiritual basis. One remembers the defense of Indian culture in the Renaissance of India, where against the animadversions of cousins, Sri Aurobindo talks about Indian culture's unique qualities, one of them being spirituality, or the most signal quality being spirituality. So when Professor Sethuraman recognizes Sri Aurobindo as a philosopher and aesthetician, he places his contribution as restoring to Indian art its spiritual basis. Paying deserved tribute to Sri Aurobindo, he declares that, and I quote Professor Sethuraman, Sri Aurobindo's synthetic vision has not only recovered for us the salient principles of ancient Indian aesthetics, but their potentialities too. His application of these principles has helped him to attempt a revaluation of both Indian and Western literature, bringing out their relevance to us, and thereby underlining the relevance of Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic, and which will continue even in the years to come. While Sri Aurobindo expects to see in others, and I quote Professor Sethuraman, the very inmost language of the self-experience of the spiritual mind, he is quite clearly the most credible example of that expectation. Sri Aurobindo went beyond the semantic and epistemic layers to see the poem as Pashyanti Vak, or the revealed word, that he saw more clearly than most critics with whom he is compared. On that note, let me thank Professor Ananda Reddy, my friends at Sakar, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on Sri Aurobindo as a literary critic. Thank you all very much.